All right. Well, thanks for watching Plant Replant. You're here with Ricky and Jacob, and we're here today with Phil Sasser. Phil has a number of roles in the Sovereign Grace Churches, but he is a pastor at Sovereign Grace Church of Apex in North Carolina. He also leads and chairs the Polity Committee in Sovereign Grace, but he also chaired the committee that gave us the Sovereign Grace Book of Church Order. And besides all of those things, which we love him for, he's from North Carolina, a state that loves freedom almost as much as Texas and New Hampshire. So we're very glad to welcome Phil onto this broadcast. Thanks for being with us, Phil.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I want to insert one thing about Phil that I love, probably as much or if not more than anything else about him, which is that we discovered during the Pastor's College his method of connecting missionally with his area was one of the best methods I've ever heard, which is he shot pool on a team in his community. And Phil, I would love for you to tell us what your team's name was in this when you did this.
Well, we joined an 8-ball league, one of the local pool halls, so kind of a fancy pool hall, and so we did just a kind of outreach to be able to interact with people. So a bunch of our guys from church here formed a team called the Calvinist, and so that was a good conversation starter. And people would say, "What does that mean?" I said, "Well, it means we're predestined to win." But we didn't always. But we had some great conversations. We did that for about 3 years. And part of my misspent youth was in pool halls, and so I did bring a certain expertise to the task. And
that's awesome.
So that was 2004 or 5, the first year we did it, and there are 800 8-ball players playing in leagues in APH. American Pool Players Association leagues in Greater Raleigh, North Carolina area.
Oh, wow.
And so I finished ranked 7th.
Oh, man.
By the end of the first year, so a lot of my old stuff came back to me. So hopefully it was used more redemptively. It was between 1964 and 1969.
Oh man, that's awesome, Phil. Well, I had to throw that in because I just love that about you. That's awesome. Well, let's dive into the some polity questions. Jacob, you cool if I start with the first one?
Go ahead.
Okay, Phil. So, what would you say to a person in a Sovereign Grace church or any church that doesn't really believe that polity matters a whole lot to them personally? In other words, they understand that their church has a polity, they don't think it matters a whole lot. How would you try to reinforce why this is important with somebody in one of our churches?
Well, first of all, say polity is important because in many ways it determines how we behave in the household of God. And the Scripture, all polity does is reflect biblical commandments, biblical precepts about how Christians ought to conduct themselves and how the church ought to be governed. So the governance of the church is a significant issue. So the governance of the church is one of the ways God has ordained elders. He's ordained a particular government, I believe, that's based around elder rule. And when that government functions biblically, then it helps to guard our doctrine. It helps to guard the gospel. The gospel and doctrine are always at risk. Remember, Paul said in Acts 20 that that there will be, pay attention to yourself. That there will be after he departs, fierce wolves will come in, and so he charged the elders to care for the flock, particularly doctrinally, and they have responsibility to do that. And you have church officers that are given that authority to help to guide the church, to lead the church, and to make sure that sound doctrine is being preached. If you look at the beginning of Titus, when Titus is going down to Crete in the book of Titus, Paul gives him very definite instructions about setting things in order, with respect to the churches, and in particular refuting people who were teaching unsound doctrine or heresy. So I think governance, in a very broad sense, is important to us in that we guard the doctrine of the church. It's important to us also how we order ourselves and structure ourselves is important for the mission. Who will be sent out? How will they be sent out? To whom will they be accountable? On what basis will they be accountable? So when you think about planting churches and replanting churches, it's important for, I think polity considerations are really critical there. Polity comes into play. It's critical in determining both the process of ordination of elders and also for the removal of elders. For the average person, government doesn't mean much, but a good, sound biblical polity ensures that you have qualified elders who are being ordained and who are not doctrinally substandard or characterly substandard. Now, in Sovereign Grace, we count on the local church to vet a lot of the character issues in an elder candidate, but the qualifying doctrinally is both a local church and it is a regional and even a national endeavor, because we have ordination standards. We have an ordination committee in each region that examines each candidate to see that they are doctrinally qualified and not substandard, so we protect the church from heresies, subtle heresies that many average person in the church might not be able to really necessarily pick up on. But those who are charged with it and are skilled and trained will serve the church by making sure that you have biblically qualified, doctrinally qualified men. And then finally, I'd say the polity in a local church. Why would a person think it's important? Well, when your church hits crisis and there's difficulties and there's charges being made or an elder has to be removed, those are times in which our polity lays out very definite processes that ensure just and fair treatment, that everybody, including elders, are held accountable. So every elder in Sovereign Grace is accountable not only to his local church, but he's accountable in a very real way to his regional assembly of elders. And that when he commits scandalous sin or it becomes heretical, that there's processes whereby the church can be protected by having either a man censured or, in extreme cases, have him removed. So for most people, polity doesn't matter much until it matters, and then it really matters.
That's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, Phil, I was going to say, you mentioned planting, and here in being up in New England and getting to know other church planters and things going on in church planting in New England, I've noticed that Sovereign Grace, this aspect of having an established polity and having definite accountability, not only for me in terms of the region, but then even having the value of moving towards a plurality of elders as we constitute as a local church is unique within church planting, because usually it's a solo guy kind of going Rambo with Jesus in a church or in a city, and it provides a level of accountability and I think safety and grace that in many ways I try to make it in the forefront for a church plant, but I think a lot of people would experience it kind of in the background, not in the forefront of their experience of church life, but it definitely provides a level of care and accountability, and I think health for the church plant to be, envisioned for 25, 50 years of faithfulness rather than, a 5-year blowout of zeal,
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think our connectivity, our union of churches is a great help to us. When our church was planted here, I was a part of that church plant over 23 years ago, and I think of just how grateful I am for Sovereign Grace and for their help and their input. Financially helped us. No one felt like they were alone. We felt like we were a part of a greater team. And in Sovereign Grace, because we are not just informally connected, but because we're formally joined together. Other churches, someone else other than just the church planter cares about that church. Other elders in his region cares about that church. And they not only do they care about it in a general sense, they have very definite responsibilities to that church. And so there's great strength there. And rightly so, the church planters bears so much of the ministry load. But when I think of all the ways that we benefited 23 years ago, when we planted this church, we received financial support, we received literature, we received sound biblical teaching by very, very like-minded men who are building us in common doctrine. We got ongoing training. We got help when we ran into difficulties, and that's significant. You have a small group of people and a church plant at the beginning. Statistics will tell you that in 5 years, perhaps not all of that team will be there, and there's all sorts of pressure. Church plants are difficult. You have a small group of people doing a lot of work by themselves for a long time, and there are certain stresses. And so other churches, we try to help. We do pulpit supply for our church plant in our region. We have one in Durham, not far from us. We sent a bunch of people in that. We do things jointly when we can because we're close. But even though we care for that church and we are responsible for the care of their leaders as well. So those are great blessings that for being in Sovereign Grace. And I would be loath to plant a church on my own.
Can I just push into that, Jacob, real quick, and move to one of my other questions, pivot to that?
Yeah.
Because so much of what you're saying, I just am totally resonating with. And at the same time, when I've talked to a lot of church planters today, a lot of them end up planting with networks. In other words, they're not ecclesiastical entities. They're groups of like-minded churches that band together to do something. And so I think a lot of planters would hear what we're saying and think, well, I can get a lot of that from this network or that network. What would be, Phil, one or two of the core distinctives for a guy considering planting a church that you would say, as a seasoned guy, hey, I'd counsel you to plant with an ecclesiastical entity like Sovereign Grace or denominational entity versus just a network that maybe can provide some of the same, relational connection or other practical helps. But what are one or two of the core distinctives about planting with maybe a union of churches like Sovereign Grace versus a network?
Well, two come to mind right away. One would be you have a common confession of faith, and that ecclesiastical union, if you have an association, you might have a number of different doctrinal positions held in a union like that. Maybe you have, but in the end, I think in Sovereign Grace, because we have a common, hopefully developing a common confession of faith that will strengthen us, ensure down the road that the church's doctrine stays biblically consistent for years to come. And I would say the biggest thing is that you can have voluntary associations, but in the end they have no authority, and there's no real accountability there. So when crisis hits, associations don't help you. Again, they don't have authority in your church situation. When you have a difficult situation, if the pastor should come under charge or the pastor needs to be charged, a voluntary association might give moral support. But none of those outside people have any real authority in the church to actually affect change and to bring help. And I think for a church planter, a church planter is going to be accountable to someone. And I suppose that your choices there. I mean, having an unaccountable eldership is both unwise and I don't think ultimately works. I think he's going to be accountable either to the congregation or he's going to be accountable to other elders. I think biblically the accountability to the elders. Not that there isn't a certain type of accountability to the congregation, but in the end, the congregation isn't perhaps in a place to judge qualitatively a man's doctrinal fidelity, and there can be real difficult questions that a congregation might never be able to raise. And in the end, of course, I don't believe that the Bible teaches congregational government. So I think that's,
just sticking to them. You know, I was going to say, Phil, I thought that your point about crisis, I think that's kind of the hinge point into the difference for Ricky's question of network versus legitimate, hefty ecclesiastical union. Because I think on the one hand, we all want to think, oh, we're never going to have problems in our churches, and if we just do this right and we stick to Jesus, we're not going to have all that crisis that all those other churches have. But I think that's just frankly naive, because when you look at the Pauline letters, there's 13 Pauline letters, and the Philippian letter was the only one that didn't really have a controversy addressed in it. So like 12 out of 13 Pauline letters are written at least to address a crisis that's arising within a church. So it's just a regular part. It's unfortunate, but it's an unsurprising regular part of normal life together in Jesus and the triune God in church together. And so I think when I look at networks, I see a confederation of guys who work together. But then I've seen this play out recently in our area, when a crisis has hit and a guy gets ejected unfairly out of a church, or there's a situation that happens in a church where the church kind of implodes, that network has no authority. They had no standing to step in and help stop the issue, or to correct errors, or to censure pastors, or to reject members. They're just kind of, all they're left with are phone calls to say, hi, how are you doing? But they can't step in and maintain and preserve the health of that church.
Yeah, that's good, Jacob. That's good,
right, man. It's incredibly naive to think that your church won't have problems. All you have to do is look at church history, and the history of every denomination and every church that's been around for any length of time at all. Every church has difficulties. That is part of life in a fallen world at this point. And if all the churches in the New Testament had difficulty, I don't think there's any reason to think we will escape that. That is incredibly naive to think.
Right.
Those places when you'll be glad that you had brothers that not only who supported you, but who actually do something. And that, hopefully with a polity, bring a process to those difficult times to ensure fair and just solutions to and well-informed decisions on crises as they hit.
Yeah, I've heard Tim Shorey, our regional leader, mention that kind of a way to think about polity is organized love. We all want to love each other, but when things get hard, we want to have a pre-established organizing understanding of what that love looks like, so that we're not run by our passions or our agenda.
That's good, man. That's good. Well, we're obviously a new in a sense, union of churches, or a renewed, I don't know how you'd say it, union of churches in the last few years, as we've adopted a book of church order and a kind of a differently structured church government, hopefully with the same principles that we always had, but with some new structures that give kind of a better voice to those principles. So I know Jacob had some questions just about our polity. So you want to hit with one of those, Jacob? Yeah.
So Phil, I was wondering, in terms of just the polity committee, what are the new issues that you guys are facing? Any hot button issues that you guys are working through? Having late night conversations, debating deep into the Bible? I'd love to know.
Well, right now we're not. Our year runs kind of as a rhythm to it. The first 4 months we're just looking in broad terms of what we think needs to take place. We perhaps have gotten input from various pastors on what sections of the BCO might need work. So we're going back and so as the year, so now we're getting ready for Council of Elders. We're presenting our amendments to the BCO, our Book of Church Order this year. So, but I would say that there's a few hot buttons for us in general. One is training of our elders. We now have a BCO, but points, I'm not sure how many of them have read or understood, especially the rules of discipline. So that's a big agenda item for us. How do we adequately train every elder in every church on the different components of the VCO? It's not a short read. It's a longer read. It's got a lot of parts to it. So the training is the big thing. I think secondly, we're giving more attention now to our regional assemblies of elders and how they function, and how the role of the regional leader perhaps. Now we're starting to get budgets in the regional assemblies. So so there's some adjustments, not major adjustments, but some small adjustments that we're working on for regional assemblies of elders and how they conduct their business. But I'd say the biggest thing that we'll be approaching this next year will be our global polity. And so the polity committee, in conjunction with the Sovereign Grace leadership team, and particularly Rich Richardson, who's our director of global missions, and he has a group of men around him: Carlos Contreras and Juarez, Dave Taylor in Australia, Nathan Smith in the UK. And they're taking a look at the BCO we have now, and they're kind of formulating what structures will work for the global churches that we have spread out rather thinly all over the world. So I actually have a meeting with them tomorrow night, and we'll be discussing their thoughts. Now, what the polity committee will do is to help them to formulate and put in more formal language what they as they've looked at the BCO and they've applied it to their situation globally, what will work. So that'll be probably our biggest issue in this next year, is really nailing down a workable, serviceable BCO for churches in different countries and different continents, which is no small task.
Yeah.
It was rather daunting for us, and the polity committee felt like we shouldn't necessarily take the lead on that. We really needed to hear what would serve those guys. So they've worked hard. I appreciate Rich and those men. And they will come up with a basic structure that's consistent with ours, as I said, and we'll help them to formulate that structure.
Excellent.
And so that's probably, and then one more long term. At some point, we're going to take up the whole notion of a directory of worship.
Nice.
So when
I'm sorry, Phil. Are you saying we're Reformed Charismatics and you're going to impose a liturgy upon us?
I'm not. That's yet to be determined. But there is a distinct possibility. We will at least talk about that. That's the one we'll stay up late at night. And when we first formulated the polity in 2012, we sent it to some key guys to have them look at it in its kind of infant stage. It was just a rough draft, and one of those was Lig Duncan. And Lig, we got on a conference call with him, and he says, "Well, the only thing I was disappointed in is you had no directory of worship." And I said, at the time, I said, "Wow, I didn't even introduce that topic to Sovereign Grace pastors." And so that's a long-term thing. I think we're beginning to think about the regulative principle and how that's defined exactly. Should we do this or shouldn't we do this? And some of this will probably depend on our statement of faith, our confession of faith, as that's grows and develops. So if you want to talk about a hot button for interesting reading, hot topics, I should say, then a directory of worship would be possible. Do we build any fences or not? So.
I think, Phil, that may be the first directory of worship that has some rules regarding tongues and interpretation
right.
In a local church.
That's right. I've already written on that. So,
so Phil, what you might have kind of alluded to this, I think, but in terms of our current BCO, so I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and we have like a very long and established kind of adaptation of the Anglican sort of structure, and so I know from my experience there that polities can have weaknesses in them, and sometimes you can be blind to them until you're outside of them. And so I was curious, in terms of our own BCO, have you guys given thought to the major weaknesses or glaring weaknesses that we need to work through? I mean, I know you just mentioned the directory of worship, but are there other things you were thinking about?
Well, I think when the BCO is written, I'll say this: the fundamental weakness. I think more clarity. It needs to have more clarity at certain spots. When the Book of Church Order was written, it was written in kind of three big blocks: local church, extra local church, and then rules of discipline. And but many times each of those different sections will deal with a situation that appears in the others. And so at times, if not, we try to get any conflicting information, but it points. So when you look at it, let's say the ordination process, what we found is you had a significant piece in the local church, but you also have another piece over in the extra local portion of that. And so as we work through that, we try to bring clarity to that. The same thing happened with church adoptions. So I think the clarity issue we need to continue to work on and sharpen those up. I'm not looking at I think we're looking at major glaring holes at this point. I think we've done fairly well there. More may be revealed. The truth is that a lot of pastors have dealt with the ordination questions, and so that's where we've spent a lot of work. Yeah. And even the church adoption, which we'll give some attention to at this Council of Elders. But what a lot of churches haven't dealt with are the nitty-gritty parts of the rules of discipline.
Right.
I think you study hard to figure out how the ordination process. You wait till they drop down into a discipline situation of an elder and have to go through that. So I think that now we're just starting to have discipline cases, excommunications or whatever, church discipline situations, elders being charged. And so those sections are getting a lot of close attention right now, probably for the first time. And we expect, so far, no glaring holes, but there are certainly some things that need to be clarified. So I would say those are the fundamental weaknesses that I see now.
Yeah. I just have one more question. Ricky, do you have anything else?
No, this is great.
Okay, so Phil, I don't necessarily read the BCO for my devotion times, but I do read the Heidelberg Catechism sometimes for my devotions.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And I will read them and I'll think, why don't we have a confession of faith? So I know that this is kind of one of your sweet spots, and I would love for you just to take the mic and give us a nice long rant on why we need good confession of faith.
Well,
page 1 of 20.
Yeah. Well, I think a statement of faith is important to us. I think it's important to the health and vitality of our churches because in years to come, because the most important thing about us in our churches is what we believe, and so to have that really clearly stated, and it becomes our witness to the world. This is what we believe about God. This is what we believe about Christ. This is what we believe about the triune God. This is what we believe about salvation. So what we believe and our witness to the world, I think, is greatly affected. I think this becomes a great tool. I have looked at the recent formulations that the Theology Committee just finished with that they'll be presenting at the Council of Elders meeting, and I'm thrilled at that. They've only covered 3 loose topics. They've covered doctrine of Scripture, doctrine of the Trinity, and the person of Christ, which is one of the places we had some weakness. But I'm very excited about that. I looked at that document last night, reading it over, going, this is wonderful, and this will help serve us. And it's and so it guards the gospel. It keeps us all in unity in the gospel. It deals with both historic errors in the church and more contemporary errors. So we have a current confession of faith. I think that will serve us greatly, and it becomes a great teaching means for it. Just like you read the Heidelberg Catechism, the confession of faith become a great teaching. You could listen to 1,000 sermons and maybe not come up with the content that you would get in a solid, just 6 paragraphs of a confession of faith. So those become great ways to teach and to catechize our congregants as well. So I am excited about the confession of faith. We have needed one sorely for a while, and to think that we might someday have a reformed and charismatic confession of faith. Man, I could be enraptured by just the thought
Would
of
you
it.
be raptured?
No, I wouldn't be raptured, but I'd be enraptured. I would be caught up in some heavenly place. I might prophesy.
Yeah, at our last regional Assemblies of Elders meeting, Tim Shorey had us at the closer of our time together. Even though our statement of faith might be our current statement of faith isn't quite the length of a confession, it's still a bit more heftier than most statement of faiths, and he had us as a regional assembly just get up and read paragraphs. And so, I mean, it took about 15, 20 minutes to read through it out loud together, but it was moving. And for a good portion of my life, whenever we have read the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed in worship, that's actually one of the high points of worship on a Sunday morning for me personally, as we confess what we believe, and especially in those, they're much more of a tight confession, but these are the confession of our faith with brothers and sisters across centuries and almost 2 millennia.
Well, I agree. I think it can just serve to really instructive, formative, protective. I was reading the Statement of Faith last night, and it talked about the Scripture as a rule of faith, and the proposed revision to our Statement of Faith, talking about it is the infallible word by which we judge prophecy. I thought, look at that. What other confession of faith actually has the judging of prophecy as one of the functions of Holy Scripture? I just wrote Jeff Percival and the Theology Committee a note of just great Thanksgiving for as they went through, and just it was well done. I hope you guys have read that, and every eldership's responsible for the next 90 days, I think, to go through and examine that closely, and so I think you'll be thrilled when you do that.
Excellent.
But I think it's all of those things. It's our testimony to the world about who God is. It's our testimony to ourselves about who God is and what He's doing, what our purpose is. And I think a clear and concise statement like that can just serve us in many ways.
Excellent. Well, Phil, thank you for your time. I think we're going to stop things here. It's been great talking with you. This is one of the reasons I love our partnership in Sovereign Grace. A guy from North Carolina, a guy from New Hampshire, and the great country of Texas, all connecting because we believe and confess the same things and have a real meaningful relationship together. So, Phil, thank you for your work that you guys have done on the BCO. It's incredibly helpful. And though I don't read it for my devotion times, I do refer to it fairly often.
Thank you, guys. It was a joy to be with you, and I appreciate what you're doing as well. So keep up the good work.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.